Welcome to ThinkData, helping third sector organisations to make better use of data. Find out more at www.thinkdata.org.uk.
So we've heard previously in this webinar about the different kinds of large data sets that are available for third sector research. And now I'm going to be talking about some examples of different types of research that have been done with different types of data, roughly within the realm of third sector research. If you haven't listened to Alistair Rutherford and Paul Lambert talking about the different types of big data set that are available to us as researchers, then it's well worth having a listen to those sections of the webinar. So, but just a quick recap, for the purposes of this presentation, the big data sets we're talking about include survey data, the kind of large government surveys usually that spanning many years that have now built up very substantial, high quality, very complex in terms of the depth of the data that they collect. And then we're also talking about administrative data that might be public or private data sets, for example, pupil census, the UK pupil census, for example, GP registrations or pensions data. Obviously there are different issues about access to different types of data here, including commercial records, but they're all highly structured databases, normally collected for purposes other than research, but very well maintained, well documented data sets, or to some extent documented data sets. And then there are big unstructured data sets, maybe that are more commonly talked about in the wider world in terms of big data, like social media, for example, Twitter and Facebook. Also digitalised text, for example, all of Hansard has now been digitised, so there's a potential to analyse that. Or there are now online media databases, Newsbank and LexisNexis, where you can analyse newspaper articles and look at media coverage and do textual analysis of that kind of things. Or, for example, GPS records. There are now people using GPS records to track, for example, where potholes are in roads, or to track cycle routes taken by people using bikes in particular cities. So the first example I'm going to talk about today is one that's been conducted by Professor Nick Bailey at the Urban Big Data Centre in the University of Glasgow, who's one of our associate organisations, one of the other strands of the administrative data funds given out by the ESRC. And they have been working with the Administrative Data Research Centre at the University of Edinburgh, which is also funded by the ESRC Administrative Data funds, to do anonymous linkage of highly sensitive data. They are looking at the benefits data and looking at people whose benefits have been sanctioned. And although sanctioning used to be in previous years a rather rare occurrence, but most recently its use has been dramatically increased, supposedly as an incentive to get people applying for more jobs, or get people turning up to appointments on time, and so on. And what they're doing is linking this data to the pupil census. It's UK-wide data in both cases. There are roughly 570,000 people on income support whose benefits were 500,000 people on income support, 100,000 of whose benefits were sanctioned in the most recent period. This has been linked to the pupil census to look at the children of people whose benefits were sanctioned, to look at the, one assumes, unintended consequences of this benefit sanction on those children in terms of their school attendance rates, in terms of any behavioural issues, for example school exclusions, and also on their exam results. And there's a link there if you want to find out more about this data. It hasn't reported any results yet. A second example is one that is actually also part of the Scottish Civil SocietyData Partnership, which is a Milo database. This is a database which is managed by the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations on behalf of all the third sector interface organisations and the volunteering coordinating organisations across Scotland. They use Milo to record any volunteering opportunities that come up, or any volunteers that come to them looking for places to volunteer, and also to record any support that is given to third sector organisations. And that carries approximately 35,000 voluntary organisations. In comparison, the Office for the Scottish Charity Regulator, the OSCA database, has about 24,000 records. That has previously been used to analyse the third sector in Scotland, but it has some disadvantages. It only represents registered charities, so not smaller organisations, but also it only has the registered office of the charity, their legal office, so it will tend to report that there is a charity based it's more likely to report that it's based, for example, in Glasgow or in Edinburgh, where their solicitors officers might be, for example, but it's going to underrepresent locally based activity, especially where you have, for example, the Red Cross or the Girl Guiding Association or whatever, who have many much more local activities going on than their central office would tell you about. And also, of course, for example, the charity shop network. So we, or I primarily, are engaged in cleaning this database, looking for duplicates, looking for errors in the way that some things may have been recorded. I'm also looking at coding, at the types of activities that the organisation is involved in, using an internationally agreed coding scheme. To look at, for example, if they work with disabled people, or with addictions, or with young people, or if it's a play group, or and so on. And this will then be made available to researchers who are interested in understanding the third sector in Scotland, and we hope that it might provide an improved, or at least a different view of the third sector, and especially valuable looking at activities at a local level and a more geographically detailed level than has been previously possible. So a third example is a colleague of ours, loosely speaking, the Third Sector Research Centre based at the University of Birmingham, and Dega Camarada has been analysing the Understanding Society survey, previously known as the British Household Panel Survey, which I believe Paul was telling you about in his section of the webinar. As he mentioned, it's not necessarily the best source of data on volunteering, but it is very high quality longitudinal panel survey that's been going for many years now, and Dega's used this to look at how participation in volunteering varies, or rather how our understanding of participation in volunteering within the population varies once you look at it longitudinally rather than cross-sectionally, i.e. year by year. So to look at this in more detail, we can see that in any 1 year we have roughly half the population or half of respondents seem to be involved in with voluntary associations, or active with voluntary associations in some way, which one might report as saying, yes, about half the population is involved in volunteering. However, if we look at this same data on volunteering year by year, you can see that on the left, in 1991, that's roughly half the sample is volunteering, that's in black. The grey part of the graph is not volunteering, that's in grey. But then you look at the next wave on the graph, which is 1993, and then you can see that some of those who were volunteering in 1991 are no longer volunteering, but then more than that of those who were not volunteering in 1991 now are volunteering, and so on. So, and the same again in 1995. Some of the people who stopped volunteering in 1993 are now back again, and some of those who were volunteering in 1993 have now stopped, and the same with those who were not volunteering originally. So by the time we get to 2007, which was the last wave of data used in this analysis, you can see that in fact there's only a very small proportion of the sample who had not been active in voluntary associations in any time during the time period of the sample. And likewise, there's only a very small proportion, perhaps an eighth of the sample, that had been consistently active in voluntary associations throughout the lifetime of this data. And this paints a very different picture about activity in terms of voluntary associations, and whether there is indeed a large pool of people who are not involved in volunteering who might be recruited to volunteering. It seems like there's actually very few people who are not involved in volunteering at all, and many more people who are dipping in and out of volunteering. And it seems from Deger's analysis that in fact people are not necessarily dipping in and out of the same volunteering, so they're getting involved in different kinds of activities in different years. And that provides a different challenge if we're thinking about wanting to increase participation rates in volunteering. So the fourth example I'm talking about today is, in fact, formed part of my PhD, which is looking at cultural participation in Scotland. This is something that's previously been understood using survey data, often by sociologists or by funders of culture, which might tell you a great deal about the participants and maybe something about their motivation for attending theatre and museums and art galleries and so on. But it tells you very little detail about how often they attend, about where they attend, and also survey data can have issues about people reporting what they would like to think they did rather than necessarily what they actually did. And also a lot of the people studying cultural participation have been interested in social stratification, and so they tend to frame it as something that is dominated by class identification and by cultural capital. And certainly in my analysis of survey data, I have found that to be the case. However, this has caused policymakers to conclude that the level of supply of opportunities to participate in culture, i.e. where the theatres and concert halls are, actually makes little difference to participation levels. And this has led in some cases to disinvestment, i.e. ceasing to fund local cultural facilities, because participation is seen to be explained by social stratification and not by local access. So I analyse transactional, that is box office data from Scottish arts venues, many of them in Glasgow and Edinburgh, but also from Inverness and Aberdeen and Stirling and other parts of the country. I was able to show that in fact on this graph we can see the number of transactions in total for each venue within the period of study, and then the average number of kilometres that the registered home address of the attender lived away from the venue. And in fact there is an extremely steep distance decay of certainly the vast majority or the greatest likelihood of attending is from within about 16 kilometres. After that there's a very gradual tail off. So I was able to establish there is a significant distance decay, proximity to the venue in attendance, which does have implications in terms of thinking about local funding of arts venues. The fifth example I'm going to talk about now is Google flu trends, where Google themselves use the searches that people undertake using Google to predict flu trends. They started in 2009 with a big fanfare where they were very closely able to predict the registered number of flu outbreaks as recorded within the US by the Centre for Disease Control. But over a number of years it became apparent that in fact they were very often over-predicting the number of cases of flu by, in some weeks, as much as 100%, i.e. they were predicting or estimating double the number of flu cases as there in fact had been. This was due in part to the fact that the searches seemed to be more closely related to fear of flu, to worry about whether people were catching flu rather than necessarily to actually actual cases of flu. And there are also many strong correlations with other seasonal issues, for example high school basketball, so that some people had been led to question whether their flu trend was in fact a winter detector rather than the flu detector. So it's an interesting example of possibly one of the pitfalls of big data analysis. The last example I'm going to talk about here is use of Twitter data to look at the independence referendum. This was done by Anna Langer in the politics department, Michael Comerford in the Urban Big Data Centre, and Des McNulty in Policy Scotland. They're all part of the University of Glasgow. And they analysed the many millions of tweets that happened with a variety of independence campaign related hashtags during the independence referendum to understand the role of social media in political mobilisation. As you can see on the left, there's a visualisation of the, I believe they're called ego nodes, of basically who UK Together were tweeting when they tweeted, and to what extent. You can see those are the lines going from UK Together in the centre to some of their other key collaborators, so to speak. The thickness of the lines indicating the number of the tweets that included those other Twitter handles within the tweets. And the size of the circle, the number of tweets that they themselves produced. And you can see there's also some thin lines going from the external nodes, so to speak, the secondary nodes, where they were tweeting one another without including UK Together. Whereas you can see in Yes Scotland that there was, they had many more sub-nodes than UK Together, and this is not including obviously every individual that might have been tweeting about the independence referendum, or even the more independent campaign groups, for example Wings Over Scotland, who were not directly associated with the official campaign. So many more independent nodes in their network of tweets, and also much more likely to be tweeting one another without necessarily referring to the overall campaign. So I've given you, I hope, an interesting, very varied example of just some of the research studies that have taken place using different kinds of big data sets, most of them in Scotland, and I hope that's of interest.